Hello and welcome everybody to Hobby Vomit. My name is Ian Riley and I'm very excited to have you with me today for our review of part 1 of Gardens of the Moon. This is part of the Tale of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now I think there's some debate over how to properly pronounce that, so if you have some pointers, please let me know. But otherwise we'll just pronounce it Malazan, and if hopefully that's not too irksome. This is a book by Steven Erickson. I'm really enjoying it so far. This is the first book of the series, and this is going to be a review of part 1. So if you've not read the book yet, this is going to have spoilers for part 1. My reaction to it so far is that it's very good. So if you're just looking for kind of a spoiler-free reaction, read it. If you like fantasy, I think you'll really like it. It is really good. But the main point of this is to kind of go into what my thoughts are of part 1 and some things and predictions I have for the future. I have not read further into the book as of the time of this recording, so I don't have any spoilers for you from part 2 or part 3 or any of the future parts. So if you've read ahead or if you've only read part 1, this will be perfect. I literally can't spoil anything that might come ahead. If I do speculate on something, I am speculating. I don't know. I've not read further in the book, and I've not read up on it on a Wikipedia or anything like that either. We're just going to be going based off of what I think so far. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first off, for part 1 of this book, I think that it was handled phenomenally. Now, I've heard some from Matt in terms of, because he's already read this book, so I've heard in terms of some of its inspiration that perchance it was a part of a D&D campaign, that it might have been tried to put out there as a script that for a movie. And I think that there's certain elements of the story that really show. It's very cinematic. There's a lot of scenes that are very much set up like these vignettes. It's very different from other fantasy books, right? We just recently got done with reading Mistborn, and I would say that it is very, very different. And by the way, this is the cover of the book. I'm holding it. So it has been a real joy to read this and to kind of get a different perspective on fantasy books. I think this is different than any fantasy book I've read to date. I have read many fantasy books. Growing up, I was a big fan of things like the Redwall series, Lord of the Rings, Ranger's Apprentice. Reading things now with my daughter based on books that got me into the series or into fantasy. And of course, I've now read some Brandon Sanderson. And I would say that a lot of fantasy books, which perhaps most of the fantasy books that I've read other than Lord of the Rings are kind of intended for a younger audience, kind of the middle school, high school crowd. Certainly Ranger's Apprentice was that way. There's kind of a certain style to them that make them very, very easy to get into, and they can feel a bit railroady. I don't think this book is that at all. It's very, very different, again, from the fantasy books that I've read before, and I like the way that it is different. Now, because of the particular style, so I want to talk about that before I get into the rest of it, because I think it's important to understand its style as a fantasy. For its particular style, I think it handles that style very well. Now, granted, this is kind of the first book I've read with this style where everything is very cinematic and things are given in vignettes rather than in scenes that are going to stitch together from scene to scene to scene to scene, right? Now, again, fantasy books can do a thing where they change the voice or even change the perspective. Most of the time, they will change perspectives, have different characters, and you see things from their eyes. But some will even change the voice, so it'll be told in a different voice, or it'll give you a different sense or immersive experience into that story at different points in the story. So I've read books like that. I'm not unused to that, and this book is certainly doing that as well. But normally a lot of fantasy books are going to be focused on trying to put you into the shoes of the character, to face down the challenges that that character is facing, to be aware of the tools that the character has at their disposal. This book very much treats you as like a viewer in the audience, that you are someone who is being told this story, who is getting to witness this story, and it's sort of unfolding around you. You feel very much like someone on the outside looking in and sort of watching things as they occur. You'll take an interest in the characters and the development of the story, but the book is not trying hard to make it feel like you are that character, make it seem like you are that character. It's very clear that you are observing these characters and watching their lives unfold. And as such, when things happen, it doesn't spend any time trying to explain what is happening. Now, I know that some people will find that to be a turnoff or find that to be a negative. I find it really to be a positive. I actually find myself more immersed in the story when the things are unfolding around me, when I just get to enjoy them, and the book is not trying to hold my hand. It doesn't need to stop to explain to me, hey, this is why this is working. Okay? It can just explain what happened, and I can observe the thing that's happening, and I'll figure out the underlying mechanics later as I start to see more occurrences of those actions. And I really enjoy that, actually. And so I would say that as someone who's never been immersed in the style before, never read this kind of style before, and doing it for the very first time with this book, I really like it. I really like it a lot, actually. And again, I know there are some people who prefer the more railroaded fantasy books, who prefer having their hands held, and that's totally fine. I'm not knocking on that, but I do enjoy now kind of just getting to watch the story and then have my own speculations about the story. So I think the style of this book is being handled very well. So I wanted to start there because I think it is a bit different, and I want to get that out up front. Now, I'm not doing kind of a barf review here because I've not read the entire book yet. That'll save that for the end. But I'm kind of going to try to break this up into different parts, and I kind of have a roadmap of how I want to do it. So I wanted to start with style. And the reason why I want to start with style is because then we need to bounce into the characters and how this style is being used to develop the characters. Because I think that this is a fantasy book that takes a very character-centric approach. And I kind of want to take a small little tangent to talk to you guys about D&D, if you'll permit me. Okay, and then I'm going to rope this all back around to what the genre actually is and how the characters are being developed. Okay, so I don't know, but what Matt told me was that this was actually written as a D&D campaign, and I would totally believe it because a lot of the presentation, especially early on in the book, is very much like how you'll see D&D DMs or GMs for Pathfinder or something else kind of open up a story. I've done it myself many, many times since I've gotten to DM now. I've kind of been a forever DM since about 2012, or actually 2010. So I've been kind of a forever DM for 15 years. And so this is what I've done as well, is you kind of set up these vignettes. Now, the thing about D&D that you need to be aware of is that even though D&D is character based, right? It's sort of the whole idea is the story should be rooted in the development of the characters, and you should try to weave in your own stories. Because it's as a game meant to have a story the characters can play through without requiring that the players themselves be super creative, it has to take a very mechanically driven approach to fantasy, or specifically to their stories, meaning that the encounters and the challenges and the mechanics of the game can help drive things. Now, keep in mind that D&D, of course, has been watered down over the years to get more and more players involved. And so especially today, there's a lot of like hand waving that can occur in the game, which many people do enjoy. It's still mechanically driven. Everything about the progression of the story and the progression of the game is very rooted in your dice rolls, your stats, the evolution of your character through their levels, how you're building them, the choices that you make, which have mechanical consequences. Everything is mechanical. And so it is a very mechanically driven story. Okay. Now, some fantasy books can very much feel mechanically driven. And oftentimes we might even say that they are plot driven, that the plot presents a force on the protagonist that is essentially compelling them to move forward. Okay. So there's a plot driven force. Where certain fantasy books can be more mechanically driven is when they have a strong emphasis on the things that the character can do. And so one of the things I like to do when I talk about fantasy books is kind of talk about a difference between the plot driven and the mechanical driven stories, where there are certain stories that are very much about the evolution of a certain character and what they can do. And when a fantasy story is very mechanically driven, then the reader needs to be aware of what the characters can do because they need to be able to solve problems as the character. And I would say that, for example, when I was reading Mistborn, it leans very heavily into its magic system, and there very much was this element of this mechanically driven story, that a lot of it was related to how the characters could use their powers. And then there might be stories that are very plot driven. So for example, like Lord of the Rings is a very plot driven story. The having to take the ring to Mount Doom kind of compels the characters, and then we get to see this epic unfold around them. right? And there's going to be other fantasy stories, and you probably read many of them, that are very plot driven. The sort of the villain or the inciting event is compelling the characters to move forward. In these stories, the reader needs to have an active awareness of who the villain is, what the villain is about, what the goal is for our protagonist, and when they've met the goal, or at least be able to know when they've met the goal, right? If Frodo throws the ring into Mount Doom and the ring burns up, the story should be done, right? We've met the goal. And now what a lot of high fantasy books, okay, so I'm starting to introduce some more terminology here. So what some high fantasy books are going to try to do is they're going to try to ratchet you up. Okay, first you have this villain and you have this goal, but then that unleashes a new villain and a new goal, and it just ratchets itself up, okay? But there is a third category within this space, which is called character-driven development, where the evolution of your characters, both in terms of their personality, their flaws, their abilities, very much drives the story. In these kinds of stories, you may not necessarily know all the things that the characters can do because it's not mechanically driven. You may not know who the big villain is or what the goals are of the character because it's not plot driven. What you do know is what the character is like, and you may know what their current task is or what they're trying to do, but the book is going to place an emphasis on trying to illustrate what that character's current motivations are, at least for the current scene, but more also importantly, their flaws. And you're going to see some interplay between those characters and other characters to get to know their personalities and what they're like. And you may be with them for a short period of time, you may be with them for a long period of time, but the important thing is that you get to know the characters. And every scene is about the interplay of those characters. And so you'll know these books when you read them, or when you, for example, if you have a movie like this, because you'll be in a scene and you'll be seeing what the characters are doing, and there might be tension, there might be things that need to be resolved, but you might wonder, okay, well, how does this scene develop a certain skill for the character? Or you might wonder, how does this scene help progress the character towards a plot, right? Towards a certain goal that's at the end of the book you might want. And you might be curious and not know what the answer to those questions are because it's still shrouded in mystery. And that's a good indication that you have a character-driven book, because this scene is really about the characters and you as a reader getting to know these characters. And so you have to be prepared to spend some time with those characters before you really understand the interplay, okay? And then ultimately understand the plot. Now, I would say that this book right here, at least Gardens of the Moon, is very character driven. And some people may not like that, but I love that. I'm very character oriented. I want to get to know my characters. I want to get to know what they're about. Then I want to see what their goals are. So that way I can see that there's an organic relationship to those things. And then I want to see how they come together and interplay. And because of that, I will say that I think part one was phenomenal in its presentation, because it did exactly what part one of a book like this should do, was it brought three key characters together. Okay. So now putting that to the side for just a second, last little bit before we get into those characters is the genre. I asked Matt, I was like, hey Matt, what genre is this, right? Because obviously it's fantasy, but you know, there are more subgenres of fantasy. There's high fantasy, low fantasy, sword and sorcery. And he was like, you just got to read it because it's got a lot of stuff going on. And so after reading it, I have a pretty good indication, I think, of what the... Sorry, got to give my kiddo some water. I have a pretty good indication, I think, of the kind of fantasy that this is. And it appears to be essentially a Greek epic. Now, what defines a Greek epic is that you typically have elements of divinity or deities or pantheism or polytheism or even monotheism, doesn't really matter. But those characters, the characters that represent the divinity, are actually present in the world and acting in the world. And then specifically what will make it a Greek epic is if the disposition of those divinities, they don't really care about humanity or the protagonist or the antagonist. They're sort of doing things of their own design. In Greek stories, the gods very much play with mankind. That mankind can be their plaything. And so if you see that kind of element in your story, then you kind of have a Greek epic. And that's essentially what we have here, is a Greek epic. Now, what's fun is that there are other elements of a Greek epic that are currently absent. And for those of you that like D&D, so I always bring everything back around, then you'll know and be familiar with this element of Greek epics, right? The element of the enchanted weapon, the need to find the sword or the bow or the shield, right? That will allow you to slay the god. Essentially, that there is something that you need to oppose. You can't actually oppose it, and therefore must go find some artifact touched by divinity in order to oppose the divine. Okay? Very, very common trope. Not present yet in this story. Instead, what's been driving a lot of the story so far, or carrying it, if you will, not really driving, but carrying it, has actually been elements of sword and sorcery, which is really cool. And if you're not familiar with sword and sorcery, in sword and sorcery, typically magic is presented as the danger. Okay? So there's other terms for this too. Some people might call it like dark fantasy or low fantasy, but technically the distinctions there are a little bit more stark. Technically, high fantasy is magic is ever present, magic is hard, and you know exactly how magic works, and you as the reader can actually try to use magic to solve problems. You effectively, whenever people use magic, you understand it. Low fantasy is that magic may be rare or ever present, but you don't really understand how it works, or it might have a hard system, but you don't really understand how it works. So like Lord of the Rings is like a low fantasy. It's both rare and you don't really understand how it works. But they're typically in those kind of stories, magic is just a part of the world, and typically it's ambivalent as to whether or not it's good or bad, right? Usually magic is not like the thing you're fighting against unless you also yourself use magic. Specifically talking about the characters there. But in sword and sorcery, usually magic is the opposition, that it's actually meant to be dangerous and scary, and that it could be used against our characters or by our characters. But the fact that our characters use it doesn't necessarily make them good guys. And a classic example of this would be like The Witcher. Like in The Witcher, the monsters and the wizards and the mages and the witches, they're dangerous because they can use this force. And the force itself is dangerous. Right? The very use of magic can burn out the soul, right? Now, that's what's crazy about this is we're seeing this sort of Greek epic, but very much present in the universe is this magic system through the warrens. So the wizards in the story can tap into the warrens to draw their power. Presumably that comes with certain consequences, because we're told again and again, like especially by Whiskey Jack, that in order to be powerful, you can't have a weak spine. You got to be tough. And because the warrens are dangerous, right? And our first investigation of the warrens, if you will, was actually people using it to travel. So specifically Perrin, we'll say Perrin, that sounds better. Perrin and another Blade, whose name I'm forgetting all of a sudden, but they're effectively the knives of the sort of assassins of Lacine. That they travel through the warren and they see this marking in the sand as if something else were present. We also come to find out that the warrens are in some sense attached to the gods, or at least our pantheon, and those are of course very dangerous, right? There are very few interactions with those beings have spelled death in almost all cases. So very dangerous, and yet our characters toil with these, they play with these, they draw from these. And that's how they fuel their magic. And one of the consequences we observe of them drawing their magic is that it has an actual effect on other people. They can smell bad smells or odorous smells. They can feel nauseous in their stomach. They can visibly throw up. We see a scene where Tattersail, when is it Airlock? Oh my gosh, I'm so bad with names sometimes. But when or I don't want to call him Hemlock because that's the weed, but it's appropriate if we want to call him that. But I think it's Airlock, so or Herlock or whatever. But whenever he's a doll and the hound Gears attacks and he uses his warrens, it causes Tattersail to throw up, right? And so it has a dangerous effect, or a sort of a negative effect on those around it. So it's dangerous. And also, of course, we see this awesome, my favorite scene is when they're going against the Moonspawn and the king of the Moonspawn comes up and it's just this epic fight, right? The whole plains is being destroyed. And if you think about it from the perspective of the soldiers, right? One of the things that Tattersail kind of talks about is how she wasn't able to save a group of soldiers who get just decimated by flames. She wasn't able to save them, and she felt guilt guilt over that because there's an understanding, right, that they'll protect you because you'll protect them. There's just certain forces in the world that common soldiers are defenseless against, and these are one of those forces. This magical force can just decimate common folks, and so they need mages, right, the people who can draw on the Warrens present to defend them. And so she feels guilt that she protects herself over them because they would have given their lives to protect her, because these kind of moments would happen. Yet in this moment, she instinctively protects herself, which makes sense for a character and something that we come to understand later. And I love this. Sword and sorcery, like the more you get into fantasy, the more, in my opinion, the more cool sword and sorcery gets. So bring that all back to the characters now. So now what we have is we have a story about a set of characters who are in a world of essentially epic proportions where gods can be involved at any given point in time, and they're dangerous. Gods can present themselves as normal people, which is very similar to Greek mythology and also Greek epics. And so encountering people can have severe consequences. And also our characters, as such, do tend to stick to their principles. So they just behave by principle, which I think is really, really great. And so we see this all very much with Perrin, right, is that he behaves by principle. Even as a small child, as we see in his prologue, he wants to be a warrior, a soldier, because of the principles of honor and conduct and code and the need that he sees for men to be in that position. Even though, as we find out, nobility is hated, right? He's hated for being both noble and being in that position. But Perrin is one of our main characters so far. And in our prologue scene, we actually get to meet Whiskey Jack, although we don't know it, who is a captain at the time and still a bridge burner. And of course, that's our second character. And Whiskey Jack is sort of a stands in contrast to Perrin at the time. He's meant to represent the sort of cynicism that comes from learned experience being a soldier. And so in some sense, he gives us an image of what Perrin will become should Perrin pursue this path, which is also meant to show us that Whiskey Jack is meant to be a character of honor and reputation, right? Because Perrin is someone that even as a child we're meant to respect. And certainly that's what Whiskey Jack is. He is someone who we are going to respect and should respect, at least at this time. Maybe we'll learn other things about him, but for now, he is a character of respect. So these are our sort of first two characters. Our third character, of course, is Tattersail. And so Tattersail is going to represent that magical element of the story to help us understand the danger that there is in this story. But if you kind of pay attention, I shouldn't say pay attention, but if you're following very closely, let's put it that way, to the story, one of the things that I noticed is that basically by the end of the first chapter, so prologue and first chapter, it's still not clear who our actual villain is or what the objectives are. Because we start off with this really interesting scene of soldiers and people. It becomes clear now that Lysine has risen as Empress. We don't really like her, and there's definitely an element of a coup that she usurped the existing emperor, but we don't know that he's necessarily a good guy or a bad guy. But it doesn't really matter because there's someone new on the throne, and that's what matters. But we know that Whiskey Jack doesn't really like her, right? We at least know that a little bit because there's an interaction in the prologue. And there appears to be these cases of conflict and war and siege and things like that taking place through the prologue into the first chapter. And then we all of a sudden find ourselves in this very weird contingent where we have a group of people traveling by road and they come across a contingent of soldiers. And then we find ourselves from the perspective of this young fisher girl whose name we don't know, at least I don't remember, counters Riga, who's this witch. And then the witch starts to spout prophecy, which of course is very fascinating, but completely unknown to us. These two characters show up. They hit her in the head with their glove. She literally dies. And then all of a sudden they turn on the fisher girl. They draw on the Warrens. We don't even understand what's going on right now. They speak of shadow and of hounds, and none of it makes sense. And then all of a sudden we fade out and we go to a new scene. And it's so fascinating because even though you're like, wow, a lot of that just went over my head, there's also an element of that was really cool and really tense, right? Because I don't know what they're doing. And so it kind of also puts you in the perspective of this fisher girl, right? All of a sudden she's meeting a witch with wax handles who supposedly can trap souls. And now this person has killed her with a single strike of their glove. And now they're drawing shadows and speaking in weird terms, but also talking about her death. So put yourself in the perspective of that young girl, right? Whose entire life is coming to an end, who has no idea what's going on. And now as a reader being introduced to these things for the first time, you kind of can feel that too. And I think that was really cool. And this is what I love about character-centric books, is that they don't need to waste time, if you will, trying to make sure you understand everything, right? They're going to show you the characters, show you the stories, and trust that over time you'll come to understand these things. And of course, this does mean that part of the commitment of the book, if you will, would be being willing to go back. I get to the end of part 1. I had in my mind that scene was really important. So what did I do when preparing this? I go back to that scene. I read through that scene again. And what do you know? All of a sudden, I know what they're doing. All of a sudden, I recognize their names. All of a sudden, it confirms one of my suspicions, which my suspicion was that the first conflict of the book, which is this attack, that contingent of soldiers, they get like just absolutely slaughtered. There's villages nearby. They just get massacred, just death, right? And Perrin gets thrust into this, right? He becomes a lieutenant. He works for a mage under the employ of Lysine, and his job is basically to investigate the ill use of magic, and although he doesn't know it, to also investigate the influences of the divine in the world, because again, they can be present in the world. And he doesn't know that because he doesn't know yet that he's actually a pawn in a greater chess match. He might suspect it, but doesn't really know it, right? But what he's investigating is this massacre. And of course, as I'm going through that story, and I was telling Matt, I'm like, I don't know how, but I'm pretty sure that Fisher girl is involved in this whole thing, right? And I think that was one of the coolest revelations for part 1, is to find out that that girl who becomes Sari is actually involved in that massacre, and that she's now essentially possessed, or is an envoy in some sense, right, for the Warrens of Shadow. That we have these two characters, Cotillion and Amanas, who effectively are divine characters, or gods, if you will, lowercase g, who come from the Warrens and are now playing in this world. And why are they playing in this world? Because they're playing against Lysine. And this is kind of a cool ending for part 1, is again, we don't know what their goal is. We don't know what the goal is of Lysine, but we do know that for some reason, a mortal, although very powerful, Lysine is playing a chess match with gods, which never goes well, right? Never goes well. But this is what's happening. And so everyone is caught in this chess match. So again, a great ending for part 1 to know that we are now in a chess match. We have a little bit of a context. And then there's some other really cool elements that are kind of being thrown out there. So this is our sort of first kind of cool moment. We see how Perrin is involved in this moment. And then this is going to bring us to Whiskey Jack, and then ultimately to Tattersail, or sort of the other way around, if you will. So after this, I think it's really cool that we now get to go to Tattersail, who kind of gives us more of an insight into the Warrens, what they are, how dangerous they are, how they're used, where they come from. And I think Tattersail's like primary job at this point is to give us that. But then, of course, we're going to start to see a few other things. I think firstly, we're going to see Taysacrin, and we're going to come to understand that there is some tension between Taysacrin and a character named Dujik One-Arm. Dujik, who's beloved by his soldiers, and Taysacrin, who's kind of universally hated, but is a very, very powerful archmage. And we're going to come to understand that this tension actually goes deeper, that there is actually a plot. We don't know if it's from Lysine, but it appears to be, to actually essentially take contingents of the old guard, like Dujik, like the Bridge Burners, which Whiskey Jack is a member of, and get rid of them. And Taysacrin, for one reason or another, is participating in this. But it's also not expressly clear that he's on Lysine's side, which I think is kind of cool. And so Tattersail is kind of there to give us this investigation, to open up our sort of first bad guy, our sort of first villain in Taysacrin, which I think is really, really cool, right? And I also think that's really cool that Taysacrin, while he's very powerful, is not so powerful, or at least so stupid, let's say, that he just sort of openly attacks or openly destroys anyone who disagrees with them, which is to show that while he might be working for Lysine or working on his own measures, he needs to keep his agenda hidden, which again kind of plays with the elements we're seeing in the story. Everyone's sort of keeping their agendas close to the chest. And Tattersail is also keeping her agenda close to her chest in the coolest way possible. she's sort of our first character to realize that she's caught in a game and she doesn't know who the players are or who the pieces are. And the best she can hope for is that her tarot deck, which is sort of an element of her warrens, so it is very much a way for gods to speak to her, is actually the only way she has to find out information on this whole story, because otherwise she just has to go for the ride. And what do you know? This god named Opon, who's essentially the jester, kind of our Loki-esque character, right, decides to throw a little mix in the things. And so he decides to kind of bless Tattersail. And now she has this sort of imagery, this sort of sound like a spinning coin. And so she can't know whether or not Opon is going to help her or hurt her, hinder her or whatever, give her banes or give her boons, right? But all she can do is just throw a little wrench in things, just like Opon, right? She just has to hope that maybe if the game's not for her, that she'll be able to roll her way out of it. Just get a good dice roll and get out of there, right? So she doesn't know the game. She doesn't know the players. So the best thing you do is just sort of take a Hail Mary shot. And I thought that was really cool. And I also think it's really cool because she also knows that she's being watched and observed very closely. And so she fundamentally has to. And she has the scene where she slaps the tarot deck, stops the game, right? And of course, our H-Lock guy gets really pissed off because he wants to know, but she hides the information and finds out there's something that she could see that he couldn't. So now she has a little bit of something, but that something is I don't know. It's just a big question mark, right? That's going to come up in the future. And I thought that was really neat. And I love that part of her character, that she's willing to take big risks, but she's aware of how dangerous the game is, right? She's taking a big risk because she feels like she has to, not because she's a risk taker. And I thought that that was really, really neat. And of course, Tattersail's like sort of principal job leading up to that scene is we see this epic scene where this moon spawn, who are really, really, really powerful. And again, Lysine just needs to put her lot in with fighting the most powerful people in this book so far. And so they fight it. But as far as we can see, really, these are engineered efforts to take out important characters or important elements that oppose Lysine. And so, or Taisykren, not really clear which one, but Taisykren invites archmages to assist. He invites the bridge burners. He invites other soldiers, but it's all a ploy that he effectively uses the battle with the King of the Moonspawn to actually attack his own forces and to try to kill key people. This leads to, of course, Taisykren's loved one being, or sorry, not Taisykren, but Tattersail's loved one being killed, and an event to save her life, and her, of course, managing to make it out. Okay. But of course, what Taisykren doesn't realize is that people are already on to him, and so the bridge burners in particular have already planned for, this contingency of what to do should he start to show his hand. And so this is really, really neat because now we have a bad guy to point at, and we get to like see Sari come back, or Sari actually get introduced, which immediately for me, I'm like, okay, you're telling me that there's this dangerous 15-year-old girl, there was this massacre, there was a Fisher girl involved. Seems like you have that person in your employ. And sure enough, that was the case, right? That Sari is the Fisher girl. I think it's Amanos, not Cotillion, because I think Cotillion is the Hound Keeper, and Cotillion is currently still in his body or a similar body, whereas Amanos, I believe, is possessing the Fisher girl. At least that's what it seems like to me. And so we kind of see all these elements, and then that brings in Whiskey Jack. And so Whiskey Jack is sort of leading this last contingent of the bridge burners, and we get this final connection that he met Perrin as a kid. Perrin will later become the leader of this contingent, so he actually will lead Whiskey Jack's group. And then he also interacts with Tattersail, and now they have a deal under the table to work together against Taisykren. And so then finally, when we kind of come to the end of part one, we have this crazy scene, like Perrin gets stabbed by Sari, he gets killed, he goes to the afterlife, but then there's an intervention because the gods are trying to keep the Shadow Warrens in check for what reason we don't know. And so he's sent back, he's revived. He comes to the rescue of Tattersail and H-Lock by attacking the Hound Gears, which of course also undermines what Locke is trying to do. And so this is also a really cool scene. But ultimately, again, what it does is it brings together three important characters. Tattersail is now looking over Perrin, right? Tattersail is working with Whiskey Jack to oppose Taisykren. Perrin is working under Lysine and going to become the leader of the Bridge Burners, but has a previous relationship with Whiskey Jack. And we can only suspect that this relationship and this new position he holds, especially the fact that he's technically been commissioned to oversee them, so that he dies too. Because our expectation for the next part is that we're going to be going to Drukistan, where they're meant to die, right? And so presumably you have Perrin and Whiskey Jack working together against Lysine. So now Tattersail and Perrin are working together to fight against what I think will be H-Lock and the Warrens of Shadow, Tattersail and Whiskey Jack against Tassicren, and Whiskey Jack and Perrin against Lysine. And so this triangle of characters will essentially oppose three separate forces. And then my suspicion is those three forces are not on each other's side. They may work together at different times, or they may accidentally or unintentionally help each other. But I don't think that, it doesn't seem to me like Tassicren is really involved with Lysine. Lysine is certainly not involved with the Warrens of Shadow, as they are actively trying to oppose her. And it doesn't seem like the Warrens of Shadow are really helping Tassicren, or maybe they are. I don't know. So anyway, I got really excited, and so I kind of left the roadmap to the side. But we went into the style, we went into the genre, we went into character development, and then got to lead that into a summary of the story so far, as well as kind of some expectations for the future. I'm already at 35 minutes, so what I want to kind of do right now is sort of give my final thoughts and my sort of hope for, or speculation as to what's coming forward. First thoughts so far: love the book, absolutely phenomenal, fantastic fantasy book, on the road to being my favorite fantasy book that I've ever read. Super good so far. Love the character-driven development. Love the story. Love the setting. It's doing so many things right, and it's really, really good. So I'm excited to keep reading more, and I know Matt and I are really excited to actually do more of these books and do more of these parts. Okay, so do a look out for more videos from me, because I'm excited to put them together. As for some of the things that I like and I don't like, I really like how the characters are being handled and the magic is being handled. In terms of don't like, it's not, I haven't really decided if there's things I don't like yet, because there's still so much book left. It's hard to say there's certain things I don't like. I have had to go back and read. That doesn't really bother me that much. I have had moments where I've lost track of where they are in the world. That doesn't really bother me that much. And the scenes that have been played out so far have been really, really good. I think that there are scenes where it can be confusing who's talking. And so I would say that if I did have one criticism so far, there are scenes where it is important who said what. And I think that in those scenes, it would really help to just, I know, like sometimes it's a little dull, but just to have a they said. Like typically it'll be like blah, blah, blah said, and then they'll go back and forth. But sometimes it just helps to like add a little extra interjection there of like they said. This, Cotillion said, Amanas said, Whiskey Jack said. Because it really is important in certain scenes who is saying what, and it's not always exactly clear which person. Because I would suspect that they're constantly alternating, but when it happens like 8 back and forth in a row or something, you can kind of lose like who's talking, at least for me. And so having a little bit more there to be like, this person is talking, that person is speaking, this person is speaking, just not every time, but just a few extra times, just to help me keep track of who is saying what. Like when I was going back to the Riga scene with the witch, I had to double check it. I'm like, okay, is Amanas going after the Fisher girl, or is Cotillion going after the Fisher girl? Who is doing the possession? Who is doing the magic? Who is saying what in terms of like whether or not they get rid of her or not? And so like the best I could come up with is like Cotillion instigates, but Amanas takes the possession. Amanas just kind of wants to leave her dead, but Cotillion wants to make use of her. So that's what it seems like to me. But I could be wrong, right? Maybe I misinterpreted who said what. So this is what I mean. Like a little extra there would certainly help. In terms of the other elements like character, story, presentation, I'm loving it so far. And while there's probably some things that could be handled better, I'm not yet ready to really speak to those things because there's just so much book left. And talking about them now feels undercooked. So we will wait for that. As for things moving forward, what I'm expecting now for part 2 is that part 2 is going to be focused on Darukistan or Darujistan, and it's going to, I think, lay the foundations for, at least this is my speculation, for how Whiskey Jack and Tattersail will undermine Tassicrin. I don't think he'll be defeated by part 2, but it will have a plan in place. I think the goal of one of those 3 characters will become apparent. And I don't think it's going to be the Warren of Shadows, but maybe it is, because they are the most present threat and the most in-your-face threat. But I think that we might get something out of Amanos and Cotillion, but I don't think we're going to understand what the Warren Shadows are trying to do, or the Shadows... Yeah, the Warren's Shadows, or Shadows Warren, is trying to do. I think that Lysine will still be present in the story. We might learn why she's trying to take out the bridge burners, but I don't think we're going to learn her game. And I think that one of the principal moments of part 2 is probably going to be the confrontation with Sari, because I don't see, with how much tension she's creating, how she can last much longer on, like, in the bridge burners. And the fact that Perrin is not dead, right, and they know that she attacked him, or at least they highly suspect, I think there has to come to a head, right? So this is what I'm expecting for part 2, is that pretty soon we're going to have a big confrontation between Sari and the bridge burners, which is really interesting to me, because, I mean, at least all indications is that she could wipe the floor with all of them if she wanted to, right? So I'm excited to see how this plays out. But those are my thoughts so far. I'm really excited to get into part 2, and hopefully we'll have that video for you shortly. But until then, I hope you all enjoy, and take care.